"Get out of my sight, bastard! You are nobody's son!" The words weren't whispered. They were delivered with the cold, surgical precision of a knife-scraping bone, echoing off the mahogany walls of the quiet funeral home. Everyone froze. 50 sets of eyes, red from weeping for David Miller, turned instantly toward me. Sarah, the woman I had called Mum for the last 22 years, stood over David's polished coffin, her face contorted into something
She
venomous
wasn't grieving, she was raging
utterly
at me.
My throat seized up. "My name is Ethan Miller, or at least I thought it was. Just 20 minutes earlier, I was standing in the first row, trying to absorb the unbearable reality that the man who taught me how to change oil and fix a leaky faucet, the man who was my entire world, was gone. Now I felt a new grief blooming, sharp and terrifying.
Man at his father's wake,
The death
you
of
have to
my
rewind
identity.
just 3 days.
To understand why a grown
life
woman
was
was shatter a
structured,
young,
comfortable and predictable in our little house outside Phoenix, Arizona.
Dad David ran a small, struggling auto repair shop. He was a man made of grease, sweat and cheap coffee who smelled perpetually of gasoline and old leather. We were close, really close. We spent every Saturday morning in the garage,
Harley Davidson,
not fixing cars,
that bike
but polishing
was his
his
pride,
beloved
his
beaten-up
secret,
and the only
1970.
thing he ever kept locked away from me. David died suddenly, a freak accident on the highway, a tire blowout that sent his old pickup truck rolling. The shock was immediate, but the strangeness started right after the paramedics left. Sarah changed. She didn't cry in my arms. She started systematically erasing David from the house, boxing his things
touch the
and
filing
speaking
cabinet,
only in
Ethan.
clipped,
Already
necessary
handled the
sentences. Insurance papers.
Don't.
I tried to rationalize it. Everyone grieves differently, right? Maybe she was just coping through rigid control, but the signs kept piling up, small and insidious. 2 days ago, while looking for his favorite jacket for the service, the old frayed denim one Dad wore every winter, I found a small, heavy wooden box hidden deep inside the lining of his
or
closet.
maybe old love
It
letters.
was locked. Instead,
I broke
there was
it
a
open with a
single
hammer.
faded photograph. It was David, impossibly young, standing next to another man who looked exactly like him, like a mirror image, only broader, tougher, and covered in tattoos. Both men wore black leather vests, and the man beside my father wore a large patch on the back of his vest. A winged skull, the infamous
Hell's
Death Head.
Angels.
I stared
I
at
didn't
the
know
picture,
much about
trying to
motorcycle
reconcile the
clubs,
smiling,
but I knew what that
carefree
patch
young
meant.
man in the photo with the quiet, diligent mechanic who raised me. I tucked the picture into my pocket, resolving to ask Sarah about it later. But later never came. Back in the funeral home, the air was thick with horror. Sarah's fury felt like a physical weight pressing me down. "You heard me, Ethan," she spat, waving a hand dismissively.
a secret he kept,
"You are
and
now
now
the
David's
secret
son.
dies with him.
You
Get
never
out.
were.
You have no
You
claim
were."
here." My mind blanked. Not his son. All those years, the scraped knees, the college applications, the birthday dinners, was it all a lie? I felt the photograph burning through my trouser pocket. I finally understood the coldness, the hidden box, the jacket he never let me touch. The entire
managed,
foundation
the
of my
words
life
scraping out of my throat.
evaporated in front
I
of
have
a
his birth
dozen
certificate.
weeping
His
relatives.
name is on paperwork.
"What
can
are
be
you
arranged,
talking about,
you idiot?"
she sneered. "David spent years cleaning up the mess your real father made. But that debt is finally paid. Now leave before I call security." The humiliation was overwhelming. The shame was suffocating. I felt the tears finally come, hot and useless, blurring the polished wood of the coffin,
Defeat,
and simply
I was preparing
vanished
to flee,
when the
to
silence was
accept the
abruptly and
crushing.
violently broken. It started as a low rumble outside, a guttural, throaty vibration that grew into the unmistakable roar of at least 6 highly tuned V-twin engines. The sound was so loud, so abrasive against the respectful quiet of the service, that the stained glass windows seemed to rattle. The double doors of the funeral home burst open, not gently,
Huge,
but with a
dressed
sudden
head to toe
violent
in
leather
swing.
and denim, their
6
faces
men
hidden
entered.
mostly by thick
They
beards
were.
and dark sunglasses, and every single one of them wore the death head patch. The air pressure in the room shifted. Mourners gasped and instinctively backed away. The men were silent, their heavy boots thudding softly on the carpet as they walked toward the coffin. Sarah, momentarily stunned, found her voice, whose patch
"Who are
read
you people?
VP,
You can't
California
interrupt
Charter,"
this.
stopped directly
The lead
in front
biker,
of Sarah, a massive
He didn't
man.
look at her.
His eyes were fixed on the open casket. Then he slowly turned his gaze towards me. His face was weathered and hard, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or raw familiarity. He spoke, and his voice was a low rasp, like gravel turning in a cement mixer. And the raw intimidation in his posture
David
was
Miller
enough to
was
make
a
her
good man.
visibly shrink. He did what he had to do. "You tell this boy he's
He then looked
nobody's
directly
son?"
at Sarah.
The biker asked, his voice now rising slightly. "You got a short memory, Sarah. David may have paid the price to raise him away from the life, but he's not nobody. He is somebody's son, Sarah. He's my brother's boy." My knees nearly gave out. My biological
Notorious
father was
Charter
the man in the was picture. my uncle. The
He stepped
mirror
closer
image
to me,
of
David,
his massive hand resting
the
gently
biker
on my shoulder,
standing before
a
me.
gesture so heavy and
VP of
protective, it felt like being shielded by a brick wall. "Your name is Ethan Miller," he confirmed, his grip tightening. "And the only thing you need to know is that your father, your real father, loved you enough to trust David to keep you safe. Now David's gone, and the family
Reached down
debt
to the
needs
coffin.
settling." Grabbed a small
He didn't wait
antique
for
silver
Sarah's
ring
inevitable
from David's
objection.
lifeless finger and placed
He-
it firmly in my hand. "You pack a bag, kid. You're coming home." I looked from the ring, which suddenly felt heavier than any inheritance, to Sarah, whose face was a mask of pure terror. She had gambled that David's death would erase my existence. She lost. David's secret didn't die with him.
Was stripped
It just
away only
transferred
to be
a much
immediately
larger,
replaced
much more
by
dangerous
something
family,
frightening,
but undeniably
my identity.
real. I walked out of that funeral home, not with a lie, but with a truth wrapped in leather and chrome, feeling the heavy rumble of engines vibrate through my chest. I had just traded a quiet life for one steeped in shadows, but for the first time since David died, I felt grounded. I wasn't nobody's son. I was family.
Remember
If you ever
Ethan's
feel like the
story.
ground is falling out from
Sometimes
under
the
you,
people
who claim you are not your family at all, and the people who stand up for you, even if they ride Harleys and wear skull patches, are the ones who truly define who you are. The truth might be messy, but it's always better than a comfortable lie. Tell me, what's the biggest secret your family ever kept? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.
Metallic
from the
tang
darkest
of
corners
copper
the
and
truth.
stale
earth hit me first. A smell that had no business lingering in the pristine, central, air-conditioned hallway of our Plano, Texas home. It wasn't strong enough to complain about, just persistent, like the ghost of a freshly turned grave. I found the key 2 days later, tucked beneath a stack of my mother's meticulously organized gardening magazines in the mudroom. It was an old, heavy brass
Dungeon
key,
door,
not
the
the kind you'd
suburban
expect to open a
storage
bank
closet.
vault or a... I picked it up, my thumb tracing the deeply cut grooves. I knew every lock in that house. The heavy skeleton key for the basement wine cellar, the electronic pads on the front and back doors, the small silver keys for the filing cabinet in Dad's study. This key was alien. It felt cold, heavy, with unspoken history, and it didn't belong to us. Or maybe, I thought,
Polished
it
veneer
belonged
of
to
my
the
life
real
began to crack.
us. Up until then,
That was the
everything had been
moment.
perfect,
The
almost
smooth-
sickeningly so. My name is Ethan Miller. I was the star history student at UT Austin, back home for the summer break, living the textbook American dream. 2 loving, successful parents, a dog named Winston, and a house that smelled perpetually of lemon polish and safety. But safety had started to feel like a
I
cage.
strung.
The
but
key
this
made
summer,
me look
she was
closer. Vibrating
My
with
mother,
a silent
Eleanor,
panic, had always
she'd
been
jump
whenever the landline rang, which was strange because nobody used the landline anymore. Her eyes, usually warm and focused, darted nervously toward the back window whenever Dad was late from his supposed consulting job downtown. My father, Richard, was the opposite, unnervingly calm, too calm. His control was absolute,
Admire,
assuming
every
it
gesture
came
measured,
from inner strength.
every
word chosen.
Now it felt like
It was
suppression,
the kind of
like
control
holding
a
a
grenade
grenade
pin between his teeth. I started keeping track of their movements. I felt despicable, skulking through my own home, but the alternative, the nagging, growing pit in my stomach, was worse. I learned that they were having lengthy, whispered conversations after 1 a.m., always in the laundry room with the dryer running, ostensibly to mask
Running
the sound.
on the air-dry
But
setting.
I wasn't fooled.
No heat.
The dryer
just
was
low,
rhythmic tumbling. It was sonic camouflage. The second piece of the puzzle arrived when I found the bank statement. It wasn't left out. I had to go looking. I slipped into Dad's study while he was out golfing. I knew the combination to the office safe, 332211, my birthday and theirs, a sentimental tradition he'd established years ago. It contained a single statement from
among
a
the
bank
boring
in Cheyenne,
bonds
and
and
insurance
The
policies.
name on the account
was
wasn't
unmarked
Richard or
envelope.
Eleanor
Miller. It was R.J. Keller. And the balance was staggering. Enough money to buy 3 of our houses, liquid cash, transferred into that anonymous account just last month. R.J. Keller. Who the hell was that? The dread crystallized into purpose. I was no longer a curious
Copper
son.
and earth.
I was an
The brass
investigator
key,
trying to solve
the hushed
mystery of his
voices,
own
the
life.
Keller
money. They
the
all
smell of-
pointed toward a single location, one that had been invisible to me for 20 years. The small, detached tool shed at the back of our yard. It was always locked, always ignored, blending into the suburban landscape like a neglected monument to lawn care. Dad said it was full of ancient chemical weed killers and old paint cans, too dangerous for anyone
The
but him
house
to
was
handle.
silent.
The silence
That night,
amplified
I
by the
waited
faint
until
low
3.
hum of the neighborhood's HVAC systems. I crept out the back door, the heavy brass key warm in my sweating palm. The night air was thick and humid, smelling of cut grass and the distant scent of the highway. I reached the shed. It was a cheap structure, painted the same bland beige as the main house. I inserted the key. It slid in smoothly. I turned the handle,
locking into
and
place
pushed
with
the
the
door
definitive
open, bracing
metallic
myself for the smell of
clunk.
old chemicals. It wasn't
was
chemicals. It was chlorine, bleach, and that same faint metallic earth smell, but amplified tenfold. A clean, sterile attempt to cover up something rotten. I flipped the light switch. The single bare bulb flickered on, illuminating the cramped space. It looked exactly as Dad had described. But my eyes went
Shovels,
immediately to the
rakes,
center of the concrete
bags
floor.
of fertilizer,
There was a section
ancient
where the
dusty
concrete
cans
looked
of paint.
slightly lighter, cleaner, and unnaturally smooth. It had been poured recently. My hands shook so hard I had to grip the handle of a rake to steady myself. I grabbed the smallest shovel and began tapping the floor gently, moving toward the center. Most of the concrete offered a dull, solid thud, hollow. But when the shovel struck the light
silently,
patch, using
it
the
sounded
edge of the
different.
shovel as a lever, praying the structure wasn't reinforced. After 5 minutes of sweating effort, I managed to lift a 2-2-foot slab of freshly cured concrete. The smell exploded into the air, a heavy, sickening mix of rot and industrial cleaner. I held my breath, pointing the shed light down into the dark, shallow pit. It wasn't a body.
Dirt and concrete
It was worse.
was the
Lying
truth.
neatly stacked
wasn't
in a
just
waterproof
documents.
plastic container.
There were
There were 3
beneath the-
sets of embossed fake driver's licenses, all featuring my parents' faces, but under different names: Keller, Ramirez, and Petrov. There were passports from 3 different countries, and taped to the lid of the box was a faded, brittle newspaper clipping. The headline dated June 1998, from the San Francisco
Headline
Chronicle.
screamed
Back at me, the bold font
pulled it
blurring
out,
through my tears.
fingers trembling
Bay Area
as I
bank
held the
manager and
20-year-old
wife vanished
newsprint.
after 10 minutes of embezzlement. The accompanying photo wasn't Richard and Eleanor Miller. It was a younger, thinner couple with slightly different hair, but the eyes were unmistakable. My mother's worried eyes, my father's controlled, resolute stare. Richard Miller didn't exist. Eleanor Miller
Stable
foundation
didn't exist.
was nothing
They
more
were
than
bank
carefully
robbers,
constructed,
fugitives,
very
and my
expensive
entire life,
hideout. My perfect. The Keller money was the loot. A sharp, grating noise sliced through the silence. The sound of the garage door beginning to open. They were home. They weren't supposed to be back until morning. Panic seized my chest, hot and suffocating. They must have seen the light, or maybe they just
Grabbing only
knew
the plastic container
something was wrong. And the newspaper clipping. I slammed the shed door back into place, fumbling wildly with the lock, about the noise. My heart hammering against my ribs, echoing the realization that I wasn't just investigating a secret, I was cornered by criminals who had been planning their escape for 2 decades. The key wasn't to a lock, it was to my freedom, and I had to use it to run, right now, before they saw the disturbed concrete, and before they realized buried where I might find it. I sprinted toward the fence line, the weight of their stolen life heavy in my hands. The Miller house, my home, stood behind me, turning from a symbol of comfort into a lethal trap. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew with sickening certainty that if I stayed, Richard and Eleanor Miller, or whatever their real names were, would do anything to protect the lie, even if it meant no longer burying their own son. I was a liability. The streetlights flickered on, and I vaulted the fence, disappearing into the cold, anonymous safety of the neighbor's yard, praying they hadn't seen me leave, praying that 20 years of lies weren't about to end tonight in bloodshed. My lungs burned, tasting the cold, damp air of suburban Connecticut. I didn't stop running until the meticulously manicured lawns of Kensington Park faded into the harsher, last neon lit, and collapsed, scraping my knees on the asphalt shoulder, the sound of my ragged breathing deafening in the sudden relative quiet. Every passing headlight was the glare of Richard's silver Mercedes, every distant siren a confirmation that they had already found the open window, the empty bed, the note I hadn't had time to write. 20 years of knowing precisely how Eleanor liked her Earl Grey mended, and how Richard preferred his tie celebrated. And every single detail was a polished, weaponized lie. I was 22, but tonight I felt 5, utterly adrift, clutching the one piece of physical proof I'd managed to snatch, a dog-eared, water-stained photograph of a woman I didn't know, but whose eyes were undeniably mine. I bypassed the train station, too monitored, and I walked 5 miles invisibility until I reached a rundown 24-hour motel on the outskirts of Stamford. The room smelled of old smoke and desperation. It was perfect. Once the deadbolt was secured, the panic subsided just enough for the cold, calculating dread to take over. I wasn't just investigating a case of mild adoption fraud. I had fled a pair of sophisticated criminals. The way Richard had looked at me human life tonight, specifically pressed him about the discrepancies in my old medical records, that blank, dead look devoid of the fatherly warmth I'd relied on, told me everything I needed to know about my survival chances if I went back. I pulled out my burner phone, connecting through a triple-layered VPN. Standard searches were useless. Richard and Eleanor Miller yielded pristine digital board memberships, a flawless history of civic engagement in Greenwich. They were the perfect illusion. I went back to the source of the initial crack, the names I'd found tucked inside Eleanor's antique cigarette case a month ago, names associated with an old, forgotten safety deposit box key: Patricia Vance and Walter Vance. The search results came up slowly, agonizingly against the backdrop of the flickering motel television. The search, adding 1999 and missing person, and then the pixelated horror appeared. It wasn't a major news network. It was a scanned archive from a small-town paper in rural Pennsylvania, dated October 1999. The headline was stark, simple. Local couple killed in suspected arson. Child, age 2, missing. The photo accompanying the article secondary was grainy, photo, almost a couple smiling awkwardly showing the charred remains of a Patricia small Victorian-style home. Beneath it, my stomach seized, twisting into a knot of ice and acid. I grabbed the old photograph from my pocket, the one I'd risked everything to take. I held it next to the screen. The woman in the portrait on the screen, Patricia Vance, was the same woman in the faded picture in my hand. Her eyes, those distinct, deep-set, hazel eyes, this was the identical to the one staring back at me in the motel. The Millers hadn't rescued an orphan. They had kidnapped the only surviving witness, the son of the people they presumably killed, and then raised him as their own insurance policy, their twisted secret hidden in plain sight. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Every single memory, the trips to Cape Cod, the college tuition, the comforting feeling built on a foundation of ash and deceit. They hadn't loved me. They had controlled me. I was the evidence they kept locked in the safest vault imaginable, their home. I scrolled down, searching for details on the primary suspects in the 1999 case. The article mentioned neighbors reporting a tall, quiet man with a background in financial services who had recently moved into town, but trying to buy out Walter Vance's small accounting firm. Financial services, the description was vague, quiet, Richard. I leaned back against the cheap headboard, the smell of dust and despair suddenly overwhelming. They hadn't wanted a son, they had wanted silence. They had spent 20 years monitoring their victim, making sure I never stumbled upon the truth. And now that I had, the rules of the game had changed entirely. Police were not no longer their son. If the Millers was the threat they needed to neutralize 20 years ago, they certainly had the influence and resources now to paint me as a paranoid, drug-addled disappointment who had run away. I had to find the ultimate proof, the motive. Why me? Why go through the trouble of raising me instead of simply disposing of me too? I typed one last search term, pulling up a decades-old lawsuit that had Richard Miller's regional bank. The title alone froze the blood in my veins. Miller versus Vance. Dispute over trust fund settlement, 1998. A trust fund. They hadn't just murdered my parents, they had murdered them for money. And the only person who could legally access that money when he turned 25 was me. I looked at the burner phone screen. My real parents had left behind, suddenly feeling 3 years before the Miller's 20-year investment paid off. Before I inherited whatever fortune. They would be hunting me down with ruthless precision, because I was the key to their entire murderous retirement plan. The motel room, minutes ago a haven, now felt like a cage. The silence was not safety, it was the quiet before the execution. If I was going to expose them, I had to move faster than they could cover their tracks. Justice for Patricia and Walter Vance. It was about ensuring that I lived long enough to tell the world what Richard and Eleanor Miller truly were. I needed to find a safe house, locate the unsealed court records, and pray that there was someone left alive who remembered the little boy who disappeared that cold October night. The truth had saved me by forcing me out the door, but it had also painted a massive target on my back. I understood that hiding wouldn't be enough. Now that I knew the full, I had to disappear, yes, but more importantly, I had to prepare to fight, because if they had killed 2 people for a trust fund, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to kill their son to keep it. This whole journey, this terrifying search for my identity, taught me one brutal lesson. Sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones who are simply better at keeping secrets. Chilling prickle of doubt about someone close to you, listen to it. Don't dismiss the small, misplaced details. They might be the only warning you get. If you found this useful, share it. Maybe it will save someone else from trusting the perfect smile, hiding a deadly agenda. The realization was the easy part. Living with it, that was the necessary cruelty. When I finally slammed the door shut, see the look on Eleanor's face, sun-drenched facade, I couldn't afford the luxury of pity, not after what she and Robert had spent 26 years building, a perfect life designed to keep me contained until their deadly agenda could be realized. My escape wasn't a clean break. It was a desperate, panicked scramble for survival, financed by the emergency fund I'd set aside years earlier, ironically believing I was saving for a down payment on a house, fueled by not a new identity, and the metallic taste of adrenaline. I drove east for 3. Every billboard, every familiar license plate felt like a potential tracker. Eleanor knew my habits. Robert knew my weak spots. They hadn't just been my parents. They had been my jailers, my handlers, meticulously shaping every choice I made, every person I dated, every job I accepted, all leading to the final, horrifying reveal, a legacy that I was not their child, but the key to a name I barely recognized, hidden deep in the archives of a dusty courthouse in rural Oklahoma. When I finally landed in Providence, Rhode Island, I didn't choose it for its history or charm. I chose it because it was far, cold, and anonymous enough. I burned the few remaining photos I had of them, the ones where they smiled with that chilling,
beautiful but
proprietary
capable of
affection.
scorching everything I touched.
Seeing their faces,
I changed
now
my
felt
name to
like
Claire
holding
Jensen.
No middle name, no frills. Claire Jensen was a blank slate, a ghost in the machine. My old life, the one I had believed was real, ceased to exist. I became an expert in avoidance. I paid for everything in cash. I never used social media. I learned to speak in clipped sentences and to keep
They
my
had
eyes
been
constantly
guarding
scanning the
one
perimeter.
that was rightfully mine.
The financial
was tied
fallout
up in a
was
legal
swift.
quagmire so
The
complex
estates that even the best corporate lawyers in Boston recoiled. Eleanor and Robert had done their job too well. They hadn't just planned to steal the inheritance. They had embedded themselves so deeply in the legal framework that proving their fraud meant dissolving the entire foundation of my existence. For months, I fought
Knew
them through
my real
proxies,
address
through
The
third-party
emotional
lawyers
cost was
who
astronomical.
Every deposition, every subpoena was a reminder that the people I called Mom and Dad were trying to bankrupt me legally, just as they had tried to steal my life physically. One cold Tuesday morning, 6 months after I disappeared, the legal battle reached a necessary stalemate. They couldn't prove I was dead or incompetent, and I couldn't completely disentangle the legitimate business
My
assets
lawyer,
from their
a
brilliant,
fraudulent-
weary woman named Diana, advised me to take the settlement. It was a fraction of the full inheritance, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to risk my safety by staying in the open. "They will never stop looking, Claire," Diana told me over a static-filled line. "They lost their prize. They're not criminals in the typical sense. They're zealots. They believe what they were
Created.
doing was right." That
For the
phrase,
family
they created, hit harder than any physical threat. They had manufactured a life, woven love with poison, and genuinely seemed to mourn the loss of their carefully curated reality. That was the most terrifying part, their sincerity. They weren't evil cartoon villains. They were people who had justified an unforgivable act under the guise of necessity. Enforced by exhaustion, I signed the non-disclosure agreement. This time to a small coastal town in Maine, where the fog rolls in thick and heavy, obscuring everything, including me. My new life is quiet. I work remotely, designing websites for small businesses. I have a tiny apartment overlooking the Atlantic, and the sound of the waves has become my constant, impersonal companion. Loneliness is the default setting now. I trace
Trust
the
is
scars
a
on my
broken
soul,
concept,
left by the
a language I no
realization
longer
of their
speak.
betrayal. I
Sometimes,
mourn not the parents they actually were, but the parents I desperately needed them to be. That phantom limb, the feeling of missing a connection that was never real, is the heaviest weight I carry. But I am safe, and that, I realized, is the victory. The true solution wasn't locking them away, it was reclaiming my narrative. I learned that identity is not something given to you at birth. It is something you must fight tooth and nail to define for yourself, especially when the people who raised you have tried to erase it. This whole journey, this terrifying search for my identity, taught me one brutal lesson. Sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones who are simply better at keeping secrets. If you've ever felt that chilling prickle of doubt about someone close to details, they might be the only warning you get. They are the keys to the locks you didn't even know were on your life. If you found this useful, share it. Maybe it will save someone else from trusting the perfect smile hiding a deadly agenda. Perhaps hearing my story will be the permission you need to start looking closely at the edges of your own perfect picture, before the frame cracks underneath and reveals the darkness. Do not let fear keep you silent or keep you blinded. Your life might depend on the courage to whisper one simple, dangerous question. Who are you really?